Okay, what's up, everybody? I didn't want to wait until I was finished reading the books that I'm reading and plan on reviewing to uh, put any more content on this channel because who knows how long that'll take, honestly. Um, so I thought, now, why not go over some presentations that I've given in the past? And so um, here's a presentation that um, and I'll probably do a few more of these too, of other presentations that I've given, but these are presentations from a series that I did at my last church on world religions and cult movements. So um, I thought it might be, somebody might find it useful. I don't know, just to go through these slides and discuss some of these things. So that way, at least I'm putting something on here in the way of content until I get to the book reviews, and I'm even debating on reviewing some books that I've already read, just to have more stuff to put on here for us to discuss. So anyway, this is a presentation on I put on atheism. So obviously atheism is not it's not a religion. I know some people try to argue that it is, but every atheist I've talked to say no, by definition. Atheism is not a religion. It is by definition just a lack of belief. And so, when I was giving this series at my church, I wanted to start with atheism because they had just finished watching the movie God's Not Dead. They gave a presentation of that, or not a presentation, but just they spent a Sunday night as a congregation watching that movie. Honestly, I think that movie's pretty terrible. I mean, I don't want to diss on anyone that likes it or whatever. Maybe it served a purpose of getting some people more interested in these kinds of issues, but obviously if you're an atheist and you've seen God's Not Dead, I can imagine you're pretty frustrated by it, because for me, as a philosophy major, as someone who was in philosophy classes, I never had any professors that acted anything like that. And it's pretty unrealistic that a freshman student would be able to just make a fool out of a seasoned philosophy professor like that. Anyway, just everything about the movie was basically just seemed like Christians throwing red meat to other Christians and not representing atheism accurately. Now, you could argue that atheists don't represent Christians accurately, and I would say a lot of times that is the case. There's a lot of straw man and red herring type argumentation that goes on, but that's no excuse for Christians to do it. Okay. Obviously, as Christians, we need to be lovers of truth, and we want to represent the people that we're discussing accurately as we can. And so, a lot of times when atheists will provide straw man and red herring argumentation, they don't necessarily realize they're doing it either. Some of them do it and just don't care, sure, but as Christians, we need to be informed about what atheists tend to believe and why, and so we certainly don't need to be ignorant. But if we know what they believe and we deliberately resort to straw men and red herrings and things like that, then that definitely does not speak well to the Christian faith, and it'll create it'll further broaden the gulf, the divide between Christians and atheists. It's already bad enough we're coming at these issues trying to dialogue from two completely different perspectives and presuppositions. We don't want a bunch of, we don't want bad behavior to make that worse. Okay. So in light of my church watching God's Not Dead and thinking that it was so great, I thought, well, maybe they should learn what atheists are really like and what they really believe. And so I've never been an atheist myself, but I have, for many years, talked to different atheists. I've had atheist friends. I've had extensive discussions, dialogues, debates with atheists. And And I think I'm pretty familiar with how they think. And it's not really, it's not rocket science to know how atheists think and how atheists believe. It's pretty simple. Bottom line is, if I can't know it by rationality alone or rationality reason coupled with empirical data that's been tested, then I'm not going to affirm belief in it. That tends to be the, just a very, very brief summary of where the typical atheist is coming from. So anyway, I want to go through this presentation. It's not very long, and any atheists are out there, if you're watching or listening to this, if I'm misrepresenting you in any way, then I apologize, but I've had atheists before tell me that I represent atheism accurately for the most part. So if there's anything here that you want to correct, then just let me know. Let me know in the comments or message me or whatever. And I'll try to, and I'll fix anything that seems to be really out of place. So starting off, what is an atheist? Well, first we need to know what theism is, because you basically just taking theism and putting a in the front of it, it's just a negation. It's just a negation of theism. So theism is the belief that God exists, or that many gods exist. So theism is the idea of belief in the existence of a god or gods. Maybe you don't, even if you don't claim to know whether or not a god exists, if you nevertheless believe in the existence of a god, then you're a theist. And an atheist is just the reverse of that. It's simply disbelief in the existence of deity. And then of course there's the doctrine or idea that there is no deity. That's a bit of a stronger definition. But it, for the most part, it tends to be just simply a disbelief in the existence of a deity. Atheists look at the evidence presented for Christianity, for Islam, for any religion, or just for theism in general, and they find it wanting. They're simply, for the atheists, there's simply not enough evidence. Okay, so if I'm an atheist, I believe something if I can get at it through reason alone, a priori, or through a conjunction of reason and empirical data. So if I can observe it, if I can test it, and I can show that beyond a reasonable doubt that something is or is not the case based on experimentation, testing, things like that, then I'll believe it. But since I don't, since there is no empirical data or anything testable to show me that a God exists, then I'm going to withhold that belief pending any further evidence. So that's the rough definition of it. Okay, so we've all heard terms atheist and agnostic, and there's as Christopher Hitchens said in his debate with William Lane Craig, it's the guy, I forget his name, who coined the term agnostic, didn't really do any favors for atheism, because we tend to differentiate between agnostic and atheism when there really is no profound difference that I'm aware of. Agnostic simply means lack of knowledge. It's because obviously gnostic is from the Greek term gnosis, referring to knowledge, knowing. So again, you put that a in front of it, it just negates it. It's saying I don't know. So many atheists actually identify as agnostics if you press them on it, because they don't know whether or not there is a God, because again, they're not convinced of it. For them, the empirical data is not there. So they choose to not believe. That makes them an atheist. So I because I've not been convinced of it, because there's no way of getting at it rationally. There's no way of getting at the existence of God through empirical data. It's not something you can really put in a test tube or in a lab or anything like that. There's really nothing to convince me that a God exists. Therefore, I don't believe that God exists. That's not saying that I know beyond shadow of a doubt that that there is no God, but I'm saying that I don't know if a God exists or not. And so far, the preponderance of the evidence suggests to me that I'm that there is no God. I could be wrong, but at this point, the evidence doesn't bear it out. So, it's more often than not, an atheist and an agnostic are the same thing. And obviously, more confident agnostics do identify themselves as atheists. That I'm affirming that I do not believe in God. So if you withhold belief in God or a God for any reason, you're technically an atheist. Then there's the concept of anti-theism, which I would almost classify folks like Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss. Those that are on a crusade to try and destroy any kind of religious belief wherever and whenever, however they can. So that's just a more militant form of atheism. It asserts that religion is oppressive, harmful to society, and we're better without it. So you'll pretty commonly run into that amongst different kinds of atheists. So my understanding is that there is atheists, along with pretty much any other type of worldview, falls, depending on the atheist you're talking to, may fall anywhere along the spectrum of weak or strong atheism. So weak atheism obviously is just a weaker form of it that claims that there might be a God, but I'm really not sure. I'm not ready to affirm that there is, because for me the evidence just doesn't bear it out. Maybe there's evidence that I haven't uncovered yet, or maybe there's an argument that I haven't heard yet. But yeah, there might be a God. I'm willing to grant there might be, but I'm not there yet. The philosopher William Rowe, in his book on the cosmological argument, I'd kind of put him in this category just because he actually goes as far as to say that I think there is good reason to believe in a God, but I personally don't believe in it. That's actually not a perspective that I've run into talking to any atheists, or haven't really heard it anywhere else. But from Rowe's perspective, he thinks that that belief in God actually is reasonable, but he would still hold that there is not enough evidence to convince him that it's the case. Then you have strong atheism, which is someone that says, which is when most Christians, I think, when we think of an atheist, we think of someone that they're saying, I know that there is no God. I mean, there is no God, and I'm sure of it. That's usually not the case. We don't usually. I've not run across many atheists that would go that route, because you can't prove a negative by definition. I mean, prove to me that there is no Santa Claus. Now, I can say that there's no evidence that there's a Santa Claus. I can say that I've been to the North Pole and I don't see any of the workshops, toy shops, or anything like that. I've never seen the sleigh or flying reindeer or anything like that. But so I'm not going to. So I don't believe in Santa Claus because there's no evidence. But for me to actually, for you to say to me, prove that there's no Santa Claus, well, you can't prove that something doesn't exist. As far as I know, you can't prove it negative. So some atheists will go that far. They'll say, I'm sure there's no God, but Not many of them do. Now, some of them will go that far, or a lot of them will go that far when you narrow it down to a specific God, so the Christian God. So, for example, Dan Barker will say a lot that he's positive that the Christian God doesn't exist because the concept of the Christian God is internally incoherent. You know, in the Ten Commandments, commandment number 6 says, do not commit murder, but then there's other places in the Bible where God commands mass genocide. So God says kill, God says do not kill. He does not exist. You know, Barker uses that line of argumentation quite a bit. I don't know if he still does or not, but most of the debates that I've seen him in, where he's in a debate specifically against a Christian scholar, theologian, pastor, whoever, and he's arguing against the Christian God, he'll say, well, as far as that goes, I know that the Christian God does not exist. So you'll run into atheists that will they will affirm strong atheism when it comes to Christianity or Islam or something, or any kind of specific God. They'll say, well, that God is can't possibly exist. So therefore, I'm positive that God doesn't exist. So I'm a strong atheist when it comes to that specific God, because the concept just is incoherent. It presents a contradiction. So, and Barker, to support that, goes through and gives several alleged contradictions, which frankly are just bad argumentation. Barker's a pretty good debater, obviously a very intelligent individual, but every now and then not every now and then, very frequently he'll throw these arguments out there that are just terrible. So it's like you could say, well, you could read Dan Barker's book and read the part where he's talking about how he used to be an evangelist, and then read the part where he became an atheist. So you could say, as someone pointed out, Dan Barker preaches Christ, Dan Barker does not preach Christ, therefore Dan Barker does not exist. You could throw that kind of, you could do that with anything. But anyway, that's where he stands. That's where some atheists will stand. That they may not say that I'm positive that there is no God, but they will say I'm positive that there is no Christian God because the concept is internally incoherent. So different belief types. Most of you probably know monotheism simply believes there's one God. There's let's see, it was about 4 years ago that I gave this presentation, and so I'm just really looking at it now for the first time in a long time. I don't even remember why this slide's in here, but it's here, so we'll go through it. Monotheism, there's there's one God, so there's and even amongst monotheism, you have different schools of thought. So you have the Unitarian perspective, which you find in Islam, obviously Judaism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Zoroastrianism, etc. So different. Then you have the Unitarian Church as a Christian denomination. I use that term loosely, but and then there's the Trinitarian monotheism, which is pretty, I think, specific to Christianity. That there is one God. There's only one God, but God is one being, and that one being is shared by three co-equal, co-eternal, co-divine persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So you have three different persons that share in their godness. So obviously the term that was coined there in the early ecumenical councils was homoousios, so same substance, and that even predates Nicaea and goes back. So we see this before the Council of Nicaea in 325, where you had Alexander of Alexandria versus Arius. You can go back earlier than that and look at the writings of Tertullian, who wrote right around the late 2nd, early 3rd centuries, right around 190, 200, somewhere in there, where he used the language of being and persons in referring to the Godhead, the Christian God. So it's so the Trinitarian monotheism is specifically Christian. It's pretty much exclusively Christian. There might be some other ideologies that have a Trinitarian view, but I'm not really aware of them. Nothing major anyway. Not something that's Trinitarian in the same way that that Christians referred to their God, using the language of being and persons. So we see that with Catholicism, Protestantism, and Eastern Orthodoxy, and then Anglicanism. They all affirm the Trinity. Polytheism obviously is many gods, which we see that in Hinduism with an estimated 330 million gods in the Hindu pantheon. Of course, it should be noted or not most, but several Hindus are monotheistic. They'll believe in some Hindus that will follow Vishnu, some that follow Krishna, some that follow Devi, the goddess, some that follow Ganesha, or obviously the Hare Krishna movement, where they follow Krishna, has become very popular in the 20th century. So many Hindus are actually monotheistic, but you don't, obviously, to be a Hindu, you don't have to be. And there are, so to be a Hindu, you can follow one god or many gods. Mormonism, obviously I don't know if I don't know if a lot of people know this. If you haven't studied Mormonism, you don't know it. Mormonism is probably even more polytheistic than Hinduism, because they believe in really an infinite number of gods. They believe that we were all once spirit children, prior to acquiring bodies on earth, and that if we follow correct Mormon teachings, we do all the right things, and then when we die, when we shed this body on earth, then we will go on to the celestial realm, and from there we will eventually become gods ourselves, get our own universe, and get our own worlds that we can create. So I forget exactly who it. I think it was one of the early LDS presidents. I forget now who it was, but who said that. And I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but it's basically something like God was once like us, and as God we may one day become. So that's Mormonism. Pagan traditions, many polytheistic examples there. Scientology, you don't have time to get into all that, but Scientology holds something similar to Mormonism in that we're all, before being put in the bodies that we're in, we're all actually theta beings, and that as thetas we are placed in different bodies throughout multiple lifetimes. So it's sort of a reincarnation, but you're as a theta being, you go from one body in one lifetime to another, and that purpose of Scientology is, when you go through the process of auditing, you will eventually have your what's called the reactive mind purged, and when that happens, then the good part of your mind, of your being, the analytical mind, takes over, and you achieve the state of clear, and that's when you fully realize your identity as a theta being, and from there you have you become an operating thetan, and then there's different OT levels. And as far as I know, there's still 8 levels. There's more that are supposed to be released, but with details regarding that by the Church of Scientology, I've not heard any more on that recently. But like Tom Cruise, for example, is an OT 8. That's as high up as as you can get. And supposedly that's why Tom Cruise is still able to do all the things that he does in acting, doing his own stunts. But besides, aside from, or despite being like 100 years old, Tom Cruise is still able to do all the things that he does. That's because he's an operating Thetan. So there you go. So those are examples of polytheism. Deism, just what it says right there, God as an impersonal, transcendent being. So a lot of our founders, like Jefferson, I think, was a deist. Benjamin Franklin was a deist. That they don't believe in a personal God. It's just a transcendent being who created the universe, but from there just kind of left it to its own, to operate on its own without any real intervention. Then there's pantheism, which says that God is identical with nature and natural processes, and God is not a personal being. So God is in nature. Nature is God. I would add to that another school of thought that I learned about recently called panentheism, which is that God and nature, God and the universe, what have you, has sort of a symbiotic relationship, that God is dependent on the universe and the universe is dependent on God, that you can't really, that the two are separate entities, but they're intertwined, I guess, and they depend on each other for existence. So you can distinguish them, but you can't really separate them out from one another. Okay, so there's that. All right, arguments for God's existence. So I wanted to include this just so the people at my church at the time knew what the issues were, what some of the main arguments are. I'm not going to go into these too deeply, just going to mention them and then give the typical atheist objection, which we are talking about atheism here. So, and many of you watching this video probably already know these, but so it's probably just be a review. But anyway, one of the oldest, best known arguments for, well, I guess I won't say best known, one of the oldest arguments for God's existence is known as the ontological argument. It was made popular created by Saint Anselm of Canterbury, a theologian who lived in the 11th century, I believe. And the way Anselm worded it was, just going off the top of my head here, but think of a being which is so great, so powerful, that no greater being can possibly be conceived. He defined God as a being which none greater can be conceived. Now, if I think of something, of a being that's as great as my mind can conceive, but then you think of a being maybe that's greater, that's different, then, well, if it's even possible to think of a being that's greater than what I've conceived, then I've not really thought of the being which none greater can be conceived. So, you have to, and Alvin Plantinga has reworded it. This argument has been rehashed and reworded and reframed. I don't know how many times over the years, over the centuries. Plantinga refers to it as a maximally great being. So, but Anselm's wording it all kind of means the same thing. It seems to me. Think of a being which is maximally great. Nothing greater can be conceived. It's an ultimate perfect being, right? If you try to think of something, if you can think of something greater than that, well, then you weren't really thinking of a being which none greater can be conceived in the first place. So think of a being which none greater can be conceived. Now, does this being actually exist? Does it exist in reality? So right now we're just talking hypotheticals, right? Think of a being which none greater can be conceived. Right now we're just thinking of it. Doesn't mean it actually exists. Well, According to Anselm, it does, because, well, what's greater, existence or non-existence? I mean, which one is, if you compare something that exists to something that does not exist, well, it seems that the thing that exists would by definition be greater, right? So a being which none greater, if a being which none greater can be conceived, if a being that is maximally great, perfect, however you want to word it, does not exist, well, then it's not really a perfect being, is it? It's not really a maximally great or being which none greater can be conceived, because existence has got to be in there somewhere. If it's a being which none greater can be conceived, if it's a being that's maximally great, then it has to exist. It is logically impossible for a being which none greater can be conceived to not exist. Such a being must exist by necessity. So when we're talking about God, if we define God this way, a perfect being, being that's maximally great, can't conceive anything greater, well then it must exist by definition. If you take existence out of the equation, then we're no longer talking about a maximally great being. So this argument, as you can probably tell or imagine, has driven philosophers and theologians nuts ever since Anselm put it together. If you're a Christian listening to this and you just want to troll your atheist friends, I'm not saying you should, but if you just wanted to mess with them, this would be a good argument to throw at them, I guess. But we don't want to do that. But it's an argument that has puzzled people ever since it was formulated. And even Bertrand Russell supposedly was known to have, or believed to have claimed to have said at one point that he was, and the story goes, I think, if I remember it correctly, that he was on campus, he was walking to class, he was thinking, and suddenly he dropped his books, looked up to the sky, and shouted out, "Oh no, the ontological argument is valid." So, and of course, now later on, he thought it out and was like, well, doesn't mean it works. Valid just means that the conclusion follows from the premises. So, Tuesday is located between Monday and Wednesday. Yesterday was Monday, tomorrow was Wednesday, therefore today is Tuesday. So that's considered a valid argument. Now, today is Tuesday. Now, tomorrow is Wednesday. Tomorrow, I can make that same argument, and it'll be valid, but it won't be sound. It won't make it true. I can give that same argument word for word. Tuesday is located between Wednesday or Monday and Wednesday, and today, yesterday was Monday. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Therefore, today is Tuesday. Tomorrow I can still make that same argument. It'll still be valid, but it won't be sound because it's not true. Tomorrow will be Wednesday. It won't no longer be Tuesday. So the conclusion will still follow from the premises, but doesn't make it true, right? So validity and soundness, two different things. Anyway, but this argument has been a conundrum. It's been analyzed, thought about, debated for centuries. It's not as popular now as it used to be. It used to be an argument that was used a lot more than what it is now. But there's it seems that with this argument, most people that know about it and understand it go into one of two camps. They either think that it probably works, like maybe it works, or I'm not sure that this works. It's sort of one of the two. I mean, it's kind of hard to really come down on it one way or the other. But obviously, I think the ontological argument does work, but I don't know if that's would be my go-to in talking to an atheist right away. I don't know if that's the opening. I don't know if I would open with that. I don't really know of anyone who would, but it's definitely an interesting argument. Now, what's the main objection to it? Let's get to that, because again, we are talking atheism here. Well, I think the most popular objection was the one that was put forth. I think it was by Immanuel Kant. I think Kant was possibly Hume before him, but I'm thinking of this objection associated with Kant, that this argument unnecessarily predicates existence. It makes existence a property. So for something exists as opposed to something does not exist. Well, Kant and others argue, well, existence isn't a property. To say that something that exists is greater than something that does not exist is just stupid. So the whole, because the whole clause, something that doesn't exist is nonsense. That doesn't mean anything, because I mean, it's as a concept, yes, something that does not exist. It's so like nothingness, the concept of nothing. The concept exists, but nothingness by definition does not exist. It's nothingness. Non-existence by definition does not exist. So the ontological argument, the objection goes mistakenly says that, looks like I didn't even put this on the slide. I just put the objection, I put it's a word game. Probably because I didn't want to get into all this in front of the folks at church, because I was afraid I'd lose them. But here just going through this on a video, I can go into a little more depth than I did then. But the whole idea of existence being a property, so like either something is blue or something is not blue. That's because blueness is a property, right? But existence doesn't really carry over the same way. If you say it's greater. It's greater for something to exist. Something that exists is greater than something that does not exist. It's that statement is incoherent, because it's like you're comparing two things: something that exists or something that has existence versus something that doesn't have existence. Well, something that doesn't have existence isn't anything, right? So. So in order, you can throw words around, but but existence isn't a property that some things have and other things don't have. It's by definition, it's something that you're talking about essence. You're talking about what actually exists, what is. So, so that's been the main objection against the ontological argument. I think that makes existence a predicate when existence is not a predicate. It's it's uh, it's more than that. So when you're talking about um, an existing, you're talking about a being which none greater can be conceived. If you assume that existence is just a property, then it doesn't really doesn't really make any sense. So the being which none greater can be conceived doesn't. I mean, kind of like nothingness. You can talk about it. You can even put words to it that refer to it, but that doesn't mean that it automatically transfers to reality. That's kind of where the word game objection comes in, right? So that's sort of, when you first hear the ontological argument, it's like your first reaction is, well, wait a minute. I mean, wait, what? You feel like you've been tricked or duped or something. So, but for me, I don't know that actually, it still doesn't erase the fact that a being, when you talk about a being which none greater can be conceived, or a being that's maximally great or perfect, it seems those words refer to something that by definition does exist. I'm not sure how well the Kant objection works. That it's just that it doesn't, that existence, that it predicates existence. That existence is just a predicate, because you're still, if you're looking at the idea that a being which none greater can be conceived, it seems that it must necessarily exist. It must exist in reality, because if it doesn't exist, then you're just back to the drawing board, thinking of, okay, what is a being which none greater can be conceived? And so you keep going around in circles like that, and it seems that such a being must exist by definition, by necessity. But anyways, that's the ontological argument, and it's probably not something that you're going to win an atheist over with. If you're a theist, it's not. I mean, you can try it, but good luck. Then there's the cosmological argument. There's different versions of it. There's the Kalam. There's the argument from contingency. There's Aquinas's 5 ways. That and the argument basically just goes something like everything that we see, us and everything around us, everything has a cause, right? And whatever caused those things itself has a cause. So everything within the realm of our experience, everything that we observe, everything that we see, everything that we know, it all has a cause. Everything has causes. We don't really know of anything that doesn't have a cause. So the cosmological argument is based on the idea that you're really just left with two choices. Either you have an infinite regress of causes, where you just have causes going back for infinity without any kind of initial cause, or you must have an initial cause, a first cause that is itself not caused by anything else, something that is uncaused, that has always existed, and that first cause itself is responsible for everything else. It's the initial cause of everything else. So everything that we see around us in our experience, all existing things, everything has causes, and those all come from from other causes that if you trace it back far enough, the buck has to stop somewhere, and it stops with an ultimate uncaused cause, or Aquinas defined it as an unmoved mover. So, and that first cause that has caused, that is itself uncaused, but yet ultimately set things in motion that have caused everything else, is what we call God, right? And you have the contingency argument that says, okay, we don't have to talk about causes, we just talk about explanations. So everything that exists per the principle of sufficient reason has an explanation. Everything, so whatever explains those explanations have explanations themselves, and on and on and on from there. And again, you're left with either an infinite regress of contingent things that are explained by other contingent things, which are explained by other contingent things, which are explained by other contingent things. You have an infinite chain of contingencies, or they go on forever and ever, or you keep going on until the buck stops with a thing that is ultimately responsible for all those contingent things, as well as its own existence. So the ultimate explanation, the thing that explains its own existence, does not owe its existence to anything else, as well as being the explanation for all contingent things. So either you have an infinite regress of contingencies, where you have just a universe full of things that owe their explanations to other things, which owe their explanations to other things, which owe their explanations to other things, or you have a self-existent being. And this argument says that it's more reasonable to affirm a self-existent being. So that's the contingency version in a nutshell of the cosmological argument, made popular by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, I believe. So if you go the route of Lawrence Krauss and many others that say, well, now we can, okay, yeah, we see that, due to the Big Bang, the universe had a cause. Well, the Kalam then would say, well, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And Krauss would say, well, not so fast, right? We have we've been. It seems what we've been able to observe is that, and I'm still reading Krauss's book, obviously, so I can only summarize this so much, but basically, the Big Bang was caused by a chain reaction of particles that that pop into existence and pop out of existence literally from nothing. That there was just no, and there's no cause to it. There's no predictability to which particles would pop into existence when. So to me, it seems like it's hard for the Kalam really to answer that. And obviously, before the findings of the Big Bang, it was scientists, at least some of them, used to believe that the universe was eternal, that it always existed, and so the traditional first cause argument wouldn't work then either. And so that's why, as an alternative, you say, well, there's if there's any way other than causation for something to owe its existence to something else, if it's possible for something to have not existed, or if it in any way owes its existence to something else, then it's contingent. But contingencies can't eternally account for other contingencies. It's you have to, the buck has to stop somewhere, and it's therefore more reasonable to assert that there is one self-existent being or entity from which everything else comes. So obviously the objections to this are, if God made everything, then who made God? Which is, in my opinion, is an incredibly stupid argument. I don't know why some atheists think this is a good argument, because we're already talking about, you're trying to, seems to make a category, it fails to make a category distinction. We're talking about what's responsible for everything. We're talking about it an uncaused cause. So it seems to be just ignoring the very premise of the argument. We're talking about whether an uncaused cause is possible. So we're saying that. Anyway, I won't go through all that right now, but it just seems to be just on its face to be a kind of a bad objection. Another one is, the universe wasn't caused in the same way that things in the world were caused. The universe wasn't caused in the way things in the world were caused. I can't really remember the details of that objection, honestly. It seems like maybe that was the argument that, what was his name? There was Sean Carroll, who debated William Lane Craig, and I thought actually won that debate. I mean, he and Craig were debating on whether or not whether or not the universe came from nothing or whether it had a cause, and Craig just simply seemed to misunderstand the science behind it, unless I misunderstood Craig, which is possible. But Craig gave his standard, what makes nothingness, if things just pop into existence from nothing, what makes nothingness so discriminatory? Why don't we see things like bicycles or root beer, pop into existence randomly at different times, different places, out of nothing? And Sean Carroll got up and explained that that when you're talking about, we're talking about the universe here. We're talking about nothingness in the sense of like a neutral force field, for lack of a better term, that where you have where the average is zero. There's nothing popping, there's particles that pop into and pop out of it, but it's something that's unique to the universe, and specific the way that the universe came to be. And Craig basically just got up and just kind of, instead of responding to what Carroll said, he just got up and said, well, what makes nothingness so discriminatory? Bicycles, root beer, etc. And it's like he didn't understand it. He didn't understand the science behind it, so he didn't even try to interact with it. He just went back and repeated his argument. That's what I came away from it with anyway. Then the third objection, common, the universe came from nothing. And so, again, I would not say that works with the argument from contingency, because you'd heard the principle of sufficient reason. There would need to be an explanation as to why particles A, B, and C popped into existence at T1, T2, T3, and then why they came together to, and why matter and motion and all these things came together the way they did to cause the Big Bang. So what Krauss's book does is describe the fascinating natural processes by which the universe came to be, but it doesn't answer but it doesn't say, well, why did these things happen when they did, the way they did, rather than not. So I think it seems that the universe came from nothing. Argument may satisfy the Kalam, but not the argument from contingency. Now, to the argument of contingency, the big objection there is brute fact, and then Bertrand Russell is known for this one, I think, that the universe is just there and that's all. We don't. So it kind of looks at the principle of sufficient reason and says, well, this simply doesn't always apply. And obviously, it's but then then you get into the argument of, well, if the principle of sufficient reason doesn't always apply, or if it's not valid, then what are the implications of that for science, philosophy, mathematics? Everything, basically, everything in our experience has an explanation. Everything owes its existence to something else, in our experience. So to just say something is a brute fact just seems to be a cop-out. But from the atheist point of view, us saying there's a self-existent being is a cop-out. So I would disagree, obviously, but especially if you couple the contingency argument with the ontological argument, it just seems obvious that something that God, a perfect being, a being which none greater can be conceived, would be identical with a being that serves as the ultimate explanation for all. That's the non-contingent explanation for all contingent things. But anyway, so those are objections to the cosmological argument. And then there's the teleological, the argument from design. It says the world and the universe are so complex and intricate that there must have been a designer. So the one popular version of this is what came from William Paley, where he says, think of if you're walking on the beach, you're walking through a field or something, and you see a watch laying there. You pick it up, you look at it, you look at all the little gears and all the little mechanisms that make it work. There must have been a designer. And so then you look at how complex the universe is and the world and everything in it, and how intricate it is. Well, then there must have been a designer. Objection to that is, well, similar to the cosmological, who designed the designer? So it'd be the Richard Dawkins retort: who designed the designer? Then there's also the God of the gaps objection, which says, well, if you say, well, we don't know how this was done, therefore God did it, you're basically just trying to throw God in there when you haven't really proven that God is responsible. Okay, so that's the teleological argument, the argument from design. Problem of evil. So this is a big one. This is a stumbling block for a lot of people. Problem of evil basically asserts that if God were all powerful and good, he would prevent evil. Evil obviously is not being prevented, therefore a perfectly good God does not exist. Because if he's all powerful and good, he would have both the desire and the ability to prevent evil. So if God is all good, then he can't be all powerful because he's being overpowered by evil. But if he's all powerful, then he can't be all good because he could stop evil but chooses not to, chooses to allow it. The problem of evil itself carries a lot of problems on its back. It makes assumptions that we know what good and evil mean. the existence of God wouldn't affect what these concepts mean. So it's really not an argument against the existence of God that I can see. It's put out there a lot, but to me, it seems just like a giant red herring. That it's the fact that evil exists. So Dan Barker, again, is known for saying a lot that all you have to do to know that there's no God is walk into a children's hospital. You see all the suffering that's going on there, and so you know there's no God, which is just, to me, it just seems ridiculous. It could be that there's, first of all, that doesn't cancel out the deist God, God that just created everything, set everything in motion, and then left it to play itself out. But then pretty much the God of every other religion, no matter what, it's not like people of different religious persuasions have never considered this problem before. They have for centuries. Christians have been responding to this since day one. So, could it be that there are reasons, there are explanations as to why evil and suffering is allowed? Why God, couldn't it be that God exists and allows evil for certain purposes? In fact, if you're looking at the Christian God, the Judeo-Christian God, Isaiah 45:7, I believe it says something to the effect of, I make light and create darkness, I make bring about good and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. So you can say God creates evil. But then that brings up the question, well, what is evil? Evil by definition is just the lack of good. Well, what is good? Where do we get that? Who defines it? I think Sam Harris defines it as the well-being of conscious creatures. I mean, unless he's revised it, I think that's the basic definition of it: the well-being of conscious creatures. So it's sort of in a utilitarian sense that, well, what does the most amount of, what brings about the most well-being for the most good, for conscious creatures? What does the most amount of good for the most amount of people? Well, again, what's good? I mean, is it pleasure? I mean, well, drugs, drugs are pleasurable, but they're not good for you. Candy's pleasurable, but it's not good for you. I mean, but then you have things like exercise that may not be pleasant, but it's still good for you. Or you have things like broccoli, which Newman on Seinfeld referred to as a vile weed. I would totally agree. It's good for you, but it's, in my opinion, opinion of many others, it's not pleasurable. It doesn't taste good. So I mean, what do you mean by good? Is it the propitiation of the human species? Is it because obviously we as human beings seek to, even though we're not immortal as individuals, we want our species to be immortal. We look out for, we want our species to continue, and our individual bloodline, specifically through having children. We want posterity. We want our species to continue as long as possible. So good is anything that aids in, I would say from the atheist perspective, good is anything that propels that along. Okay. So since there are things that, like natural disasters and tragedies, shootings, all these things that, therefore a good God could not exist. And usually what most atheists tag on to the end of this is that, well, if God does exist, a God that allows this kind of stuff to go on isn't someone that's worthy of my worship. So from there, you're getting into kind of getting out of the philosophical issues and into theology at that point. you could anyway, could go down that rabbit hole. So it's so yeah. So we're left with the idea of what does good and evil mean. We can come up with these systems of what good means, but you're kind of going back to, well, what's your ultimate authority? I mean, what's you're giving terms. You're making bald assertions. Matt Dillahunty refers a lot to bald assertions. But it seems to me whenever atheists talk about what's good or evil or whatever, it just seems like they're making bald assertions. Or they'll give definitions of what good is, but I mean, why does that make it good? What if you're looking at, if your worldview is limited to a conjunction of reason and empirical data, that can tell you what is, but how can it tell you what ought? Where do you get the ought from? Water is wet, the sky is blue. We can observe photosynthesis. Processes that do occur in nature. We can observe the process of particles coming into existence, that led to the Big Bang. We can observe supernovas, things that Krauss talks about in his book. We can observe these things, but how does any of this tell us what ought or what ought not to be? It's just I've never heard anything even approaching a good argument on morality from the atheist view. But I understand it. And, if I were an atheist and I didn't believe God existed, I would still say, well, we got to have something in place to prevent pure chaos. It's Christopher Hitchens referred to the novel written turn of the last century that called When It Was Dark by Guy Thorne. I think that book gives a fictionalized account of people find out that there's no God. Well, then they just go nuts, and there's just pure chaos and murder, mayhem, disaster. We need something in place for evolutionary purposes. Our species needs to continue, and so we base our idea of morality on that. I think that's where the atheist is coming from, and I can't blame him. But from my view, it's that the atheist is created in the image of God, and that's why he sees the need to preserve humanity. Why he sees the need to pursue goodness, because we all have an innate sense of what's I think of what's morally good, to an extent. And I think from the theistic worldview, we can see where that came from. I feel like I needed to explain this, and this is why atheists appear mean, and a lot of Christians, when they think of atheists, they think of people that are just really just hostile and nasty, and that does tend to happen, but it's not always the case. And we need to understand as Christians possibly why that is. And just because an atheist seems nasty at the beginning, it doesn't mean that we can't try to diffuse that and get behind the reason for it, and then maybe turn that into a productive discussion. I've had atheists before come at me with their claws out, and once they saw that I wasn't ready to take a 10-pound hardcover King James Version Bible and bash them over the head with it, when they saw that I wasn't going to do that, then they really lightened up and just changed their whole tone. So some, and every individual is going to be different, but here's some possible different possibilities as to why they're like that. They're used to hostility from religious people. They're used to Christians just talking down to them, treating them like they're less than. Many of them have had bad experiences in the past with churches or religious organizations. They've seen hypocrisy in churches. single greatest cause of atheism in the world, is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, deny him by their lifestyle. That's what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. So some of you have heard that. So gives us another reason as Christians to to walk our talk, right? Because you never know who's watching or listening. Many atheists who are still in the minority in this country, in the United States, and they're used to having to defend themselves. So you tend to be a better fighter when you're used to fighting. When you're training on a regular basis. So therefore, many atheists tend to be pretty well. The average atheist, I think, is unfortunately more educated, but more well-read than the average Christian, the average religious person. That's to our shame, really. But it's because they're used to having to defend their beliefs, and so they're usually pretty well prepared to present where they're coming from and why they're coming from that place. Whereas Christians, in the U.S., we've gone soft, and I tell you what I don't think I put in this, what I didn't really know as well when I made this presentation, but I know now that, and there's a book review I might do later on, like later, maybe today or tomorrow or something, fairly soon, that talks about why Christians in this country have become so ignorant. By ignorant, I don't mean that as an insult, although I guess it's not a good thing at all. Christians at one time used to be at the forefront of scholarship in all areas, in this country. And a lot of your great universities like Harvard, Princeton, they were founded by Christians, and now they've been overrun by non-Christians. So what happened for Christians to go from being such an intellectual faith to a non-intellectual faith? And it's long story short, it's most of it has to do with the revival movements of the 19th century, where Christianity became less about learning and education and thought, and more about just the heart and personal piety and religious experience. It became less about learning and more about experience. And I forget who said this, but you're basically, as a Christian, your testimony is not the gospel. It's not. It may be helpful to share your testimony sometimes, your personal experiences, but that's not the gospel. We as Christians are called to proclaim the gospel. And we also need to be at the forefront of all areas of learning: mathematics, science, history, theology, especially. I mean, we need to be educated. We need to know why we believe what we believe, and don't just punt to faith so easily. I mean, yeah, we have faith. Faith is the evidence of things unseen. As Hebrews, I believe Hebrews 11 verse 1, I think, talks about. But that doesn't mean just walking around blindfolded. I would say atheists have faith too. They have faith that their brains are operating properly, their ability to reason is effective, and that they are accurately perceiving the empirical data around them. So it's I mean, you can't prove that what you see around you isn't just some kind of illusion. You can't prove that you're not a brain in a vat. But we have faith that the way we perceive things is how they really are. That we're not, that's why we're not solipsists. So the bottom line is everybody has faith. It's just that. But it's just that as Christians, it's a faith based on, I would argue, based on evidence, based on, so we take the empirical data and the ability to reason that atheists utilize, and we take that in conjunction with the idea of ultimate explanation, the idea of miracles, the supernatural, and say that as a result, it seems reasonable to us that that God exists and that God has spoken through His Word. So, but obviously, we don't know everything. We don't claim to know everything. We don't know how God does everything that He does, but we have. So I believe as Christians we have evidence, but we don't have proof. But we still believe anyway without proof, and that's atheists don't have proof either. Nobody really has proof. You don't have absolute certainty, but we believe nonetheless. So without having all knowledge and without having all possible knowledge of everything there is to know, which we don't. I mean, what the most learned person in the world knows is probably just a grain of sand compared to all the knowledge, all the potential knowledge that's out there. So we know so little, and yet we, based on what we do know, we believe. And that's what faith is. There's still a lot that we haven't seen. You know, we believe in Jesus as the Son of God, despite the fact that we don't see Him standing before us with the scars in His hands and in His side. That's what faith means. Faith doesn't mean just putting on a blindfold and just not investigating what you believe and why you believe it. So Christianity has really gotten dumbed down last 200 years or so, and it's not good. We need to get out of that. Anyway, so I think we need to learn from our atheist friends and actually check some of this stuff out. Start reading a little more, or if you don't like to read, I mean, there's a little thing called YouTube, where you can, and there's a little thing called Audible, where you can listen to things. And if you're like me and you're a terrible listener, you can play it over and over again, take notes, do whatever you got to do. I mean, we have more information than we've ever had in the history of the world at our fingertips, so there's no longer any excuse for Christians to not be prepared to engage with our atheist friends and with our Muslim friends, and etc. Anyway, get off that soapbox and get back to business here. So for all the reasons I just described, when a Christian encounters an atheist, the atheist usually has the advantage. Atheists tend to, on average, I think, tend to just have investigated these things and thought about these things a little bit more than the average Christian. So we need to rectify that situation. We need to learn. We believe we need to learn not only our Bible and theology, but we need to learn math, science, philosophy. I mean, these are things that, from our point of view, God created. It all came from God. God has revealed to us, not just through His Word, although He's revealed to us mainly through His Word, and everything else should be subservient to that, but He's also revealed to us in secondary ways like philosophy and science, and we don't do ourselves any favors by not looking into that. So we need to study these things and give a defense with gentleness and reverence, as 1 Peter 3:15 says. So if we give a defense with gentleness and reverence and a little bit of knowledge, they tend to soften and be more respectful. Now, that's not always the case. Some are simply mad at God. So like our atheist in God's Not Dead. Turns out that guy wasn't even really an atheist. He was just mad at God. So, so sometimes that's what's going on. And sometimes you can tell that, sometimes you can't. It's really hard to discern, though, but you can't really read a person's mind or look into their heart, but sometimes that's what's going on. And then sometimes they're just mean. Sometimes they just want to be jerks. They just want to throw out attacks, ad hominems, not listen to anything you have to say. They don't really want to have a conversation. And in that case, it's probably best to just move along. So I don't, someone that's just throwing out ad hominems and just acting childish, I don't even want to give that the time of day. So even in the comment sections, if I get comments that are, people are just throwing out ad hominem attacks and being, acting childish, being vulgar, those comments will be deleted, obviously. But as long as they want to talk, then talk to them. Have a discussion and listen to what they have to say, and maybe they'll listen to what you have to say. And if you need to study and learn your stuff as a Christian, so that you'll have something to say. All right. Conclusion. So why even talk to an atheist in the first place? Why even do apologetics? Well, we're commanded to in 1 Peter 3:15. We're commanded in the Great Commission to take the gospel to every corner of the world. That does not exclude atheists. So we need to talk to atheists as well. And again, learn from them, because atheists will sometimes bring out objections to our faith that we haven't thought of before. So you take that objection, you investigate it, and now you know something that you didn't know before. So now that can strengthen your own knowledge and faith. So, okay, so this was my atheist presentation. I hope I represented atheism accurately. If I didn't, I apologize and would like to be corrected on that. So anyway, that concludes this video. Thank you very much for watching and listening.